So each cerebral hemisphere is divided into lobes. We have your frontal, your parietal, your occipital, and your temporal lobe. Your frontal lobes are important in the control of voluntary motor functions, motivations, aggressions, mood, and olfactory perception. Whereas your parietal lobe is the center for receiving most sensory information such as your touch, your pain, your temperature, and your balance. Your parietal lobe and your frontal lobe are usually separated from each other by your central sulcus. In the older literature, they called it the central sulcus of Rolando. Now your occipital lobe, which is the posterior part of your cerebral cortex, functions in receiving visual input, and it's not distantly separated from the other lobes. This is very important, the visual. Now, the temporal lobes involves the olfactory and the auditory sensation and usually plays an important role in memory. An anterior and inferior portion are responsible for the abstract thought and judgment. So once it has developed, then that is where abstract thinking are usually is occurring. Now, the insula, which is considered to be the fifth lobe, is located deep within the fissure of the lateral fissure of the temporal lobe. It's called the fifth lobe, the insula. So, in this illustration, we can see how they are being divided. So, this is the frontal lobe. And then this is the parietal. This is the occipital area. Now, this area in here is the central sulcus of Rolando. Here. Okay. So what is the basal nuclei? These are groups of functionally related nuclei composed of the corpus striatum, which are two nuclei located deep within the cerebrum, and the substantia nigra, which is a group of darkly pigmented cells in the midbrain. Now, what is the importance of your basal nuclei? They are important in the planning, organizing, and coordinating motor movement and posture. So this is the composition now of your basal nuclei. Now your limbic system, on the other hand, is composed of your olfactory cortex and the certain deep cortical regions and nuclei of the cerebrum and diencephalon that influences the following. So your long-term declarative memory, it is involved in your emotion, your visceral response to emotions and motivations and mood. Though the major source of your sensory inputs to the limbic system is usually these olfactory nerves. So this is an illustration of the composition of your limbic system. Now, if there is a defect that would occur or a lesion to the limbic system, it will result to the voracious appetite, increased and perverse sexual activity and docility, including loss of normal fear and anger response. Okay, so let us now proceed with the structures that forms the covering of the central nervous system, that is your brain and your spinal cord. So this outer covering is what we call your meninges. And this meninges has three connective tissue membranes And these three connective tissue membranes or layers are called your dura mater, your arachnoid mater, and then your pia mater. Your dura mater is the thickest and the most superficial of the connective tissue membranes. It has two layers but function as a single layer, but physically separated into several regions to form dural folds and dural venous sinuses. So, Itimodura mater is actually a two-layer, but they would appear as one. But they can be separated because there will be dural folds and dural venous sinuses. Now, the dural folds help hold the brain in place within the skull, whereas your dural venous sinuses collects blood from the small veins of the brain and empty into the internal jugular vein which exits in the skull. Damage to the vein that would result in the accumulations of blood in the subdural space, which would result to the condition called subdural hematoma. Now within the skull, the dura mater adheres tightly to the cranial bone. Within the vertebral canal, there is a space between the dura mater and the vertebra, which we call your epidural space. And this is usually a potential space that is important as the site for the injection of epidural anesthesia. And this is usually in the vertebral column. Arachnoid mater is the second meningeal membrane that is thin and wispy. The space is between the dura and the arachnoid mater is a space called your subdural space. It is again a potential space that is filled with a very small amount of serous fluids. Now at the spinal area, there are a space between the arachnoid and the pia mater which we call your subarachnoid space, which is a common site for the injection of anesthesia or doing spinal tap to collect CSF fluids or blood for diagnostic analysis. So take note, it is in the subarachnoid space wherein we can collect sample for the CSF or blood during diagnostic analysis, especially if you want to detect the presence of meningitis. Now, your pia mater is the third meningeal membrane that is very tightly bound to the surface of the brain and the spinal cord. And between the pia and the arachnoid mater is the subarachnoid space. So this is just an illustration. You can see it in your book. Now, the ventricles is the fluid-filled cavities of the CNS. There are three ventricles in the brain. We have the lateral, we have the third ventricle, and the fourth ventricle. The lateral ventricle is the large cavity of each cerebral hemispheres, whereas your third ventricle is the smaller midline cavity that is located in the center of the diencephalon between the two halves of the thalamus and connected by a foramina to the lateral ventricles. So the fourth ventricle is located at the base of the cerebellum and connected to the lateral ventricle by the cerebral aqueduct. In the older texts, we call them cerebral aqueduct of Sylvius or Sylvian aqueduct. It is a continuous, your fourth ventricle is continuous with the central canal of the spinal cord, and it usually opens to the subarachnoid space through the foramina and its wall and roof. So this is an illustration of your ventricles. So this large area here is called your lateral ventricle, the anterior horn, and the inferior horn of your lateral ventricle, and this is the posterior horn of your lateral ventricle. Your third ventricle is in this area, and the connection between the third ventricle and your fourth ventricle is the so-called Sylvian aqueduct. So this is the Sylvian aqueduct. This is now the connection between the this is the third ventricle. So the third ventricle is connected with the fourth ventricle. And at the at the level of the fourth ventricle, it will now proceed with the spinal canal of the spinal cord. Okay, so let's now proceed to the CSF. Discussion of the CSF. So the cerebrospinal fluid, there is a fluid that is located in the central nervous system, and the purpose of the CSF is to bath the brain and the spinal cord and provides cushion around the CNS. The CSF is usually produced by the choroid plexus, which are specialized structures of ependymal cells. Take note, diba? We have discussed these are types of glial cells that are located in the ventricles. Okay. Now, since they are located in the ventricles, the purpose now of the ventricles is that it provides the passageway of your CSF. So what is the flow of your CSF? From the lateral ventricles, wherein most of them are being produced, it flows to the third ventricle and then to the cerebral aqueduct or the sylvian aqueduct to the fourth ventricle. Now, small amount of flow to the central canal of the spinal cord. CSF exits through small opening on the wall of the fourth ventricles and enters the subarachnoid space and into the blood via the arachnoid granulations at the subarachnoid space. So these arachnoid granulations are actually masses of arachnoid tissues that penetrates the superior sagittal sinus, which is a dural venous sinus in the longitudinal fissure. So that is how the CSF will now flow. Now, any obstruction to the flow of CSF would result to the condition which we called hydrocephalus. So, accumulations of the CSF in the ventricles that creates pressures and compresses the brain tissues resulting in irreversible brain damage. So, I think we have already seen some cases of infants who are suffering from hydrocephalus. So before they reach the age of maturity, this obstruction should be corrected in order not to compress other brain tissues which would affect the development and then the functioning of that individual. Okay, so let us now proceed with the discussion on the cranial nerves. So the cranial nerves, there are 12 pairs of cranial nerves within the body. There are two general categories of your cranial nerves. You have your motor and your sensory. So your somatic motor, the cranial nerves that are primarily involved in motor function, usually innervate skeletal muscles in the head and neck. And also part of the motor division or category are the cranial nerves that possesses the parasympathetic components that innervates glands, the smooth muscles throughout the body, and the cardiac muscle. Now, the sensory type or category of cranial nerves are those that are involved in special senses such as vision and general senses such as the touch and pain in the face. So the cranial nerves can be classified according to their neuronal innervation. So we have cranial nerves that are purely sensory, and that is your cranial nerve number 1, number 2, and number 8. For your somatic motor neuron, of motor only, so somatic motor, in other words, they are only involved in the contraction of muscles, skeletal muscles. So these are the cranial nerves number 4, number 6, number 11, and number 12. And Other cranial nerves that possesses either sensory or somatic or motor and sympathetic or all, we call them the mixed type. So the cranial nerve that is both somatic and sensory are cranial nerve number 5. Somatic, motor, and parasympathetic are cranial nerve number 8. Number 3, I'm sorry. And somatic, motor, parasympathetic, and sensory, these are cranial nerve number 7, number 9, and number 10. Now, number 9, or your vagus nerve, is the most important parasympathetic nerve as it regulates the functions of your thoracic, the abdominal organs such as the heart rate, the respiratory rate, and the digestion. So, this is the table that enumerates the different cranial nerves. So you have to memorize all of them. Cranial nerve number 1 is olfactory, and it is primarily involved in smell function. And then the cranial nerve number 2 is called optic, and it is primarily involved for vision. For cranial nerve number 3, it is called your oculomotor nerve. It has motor function to the 4-6 extrinsic muscles of the eyes and the upper eyelids. And it has also a parasympathetic component that would result to the constriction of your pupils and would thicken the lens. Your cranial nerve number 4 is named trochlear nerve, and the main specific function of your trochlear nerve is that it provides the motor function to the extrinsic eye muscle. And then your cranial nerve number 5 is trigeminal nerve. It has both sensory and motor, sensory to the face and teeth, and motor to the muscles of mastication. And for cranial nerve number 6, also called your abducens nerve, it has a pure motor function, and it is usually involved in the motor function of the extrinsic muscle of the eye. Your cranial nerve number 7, or your facial nerve, possesses sensory, motor, and parasympathetic. For the sensory, it supplies the taste, the motor to the muscles of facial expression, and parasympathetic to the salivary and tear glands. Your cranial nerve number 8, also called your vestibulocochlear nerve, has a sensory function, and it is usually primarily involved in hearing and balance. Your glossopharyngeal nerve, or your cranial nerve number 9, possesses sensory, motor, and parasympathetic. For sensory, it has functions over the taste and touch to the tongue, and motor to the pharyngeal muscles, and parasympathetic to the salivary glands. Your cranial nerve number 10, or your vagus nerve, possesses your sensory, motor, and parasympathetic. And I would like rather to emphasize that the parasympathetic component of your vagus nerve involves the viscera of the thorax and the abdomen. Now, your cranial nerve number 11, or your accessory, has a pure motor function, and it has mostly it innervates the muscles of the neck and the upper back muscles. Your hypoglossal, or your cranial nerve number 12, is purely motor, and it provides the motor innervation for your muscles of the tongue. So this is an illustration of where your cranial nerves usually originates at the base of on the inferior view rather of your brain. Now let us proceed with the autonomic nervous system. Your autonomic nervous system comprises motor neurons that carry action potentials from the CNS to the periphery, and it innervates the smooth muscles, the cardiac muscles, and the glands. They are called, or they are rather controlled unconsciously, and composed of two neuron series that extends from the CNS to the effector organ. And these two neuron series are your preganglionic neuron and your postganglionic neuron. Now, it is composed of two neuron series that extends from the CNS to the effector organ, and they are named ganglionic because preganglionic neuron form a synapse with the postganglionic neuron in the autonomic ganglia within the PNS. With the exception of the preganglionic neuron that extends to the adrenal gland, where the postganglionic neuron are actually the hormones that secretes the cells of the adrenal medulla. There are two divisions of your ANS. You have your sympathetic division and you have your parasympathetic division. The sympathetic divisions are cell bodies of the sympathetic preganglionic neuron and are in the lateral horn of the spinal gray matter between T1 and L2. And each axon exits through the ventral root to form the sympathetic chain ganglia along the both sides of the spinal cord. And it usually prepares the person for physical activity. Now, what are the main actions of your sympathetic nervous system? So, the main action of your sympathetic nervous system is to increase the heart rate and the blood pressure, to dilate the respiratory passage to increase airflow, and to stimulate the release of glucose from the liver for energy, and it inhibits digestive activity. It increases activity of the organs not essential for maintenance of the physical activity and shuns bloods and nutrients to structures that are active during activity. In other words, your sympathetic nervous system is primarily involved in fight or flight. That's why it is also referred to as your fight or flight. Your parasympathetic division are your cell bodies of the preganglionic parasympathetic divisions that are located either within the brainstem nuclei of the oculomotor nerve, meaning it is more superior. It is now on the cerebral area, and the cerebral cortex. In the upper part of the brain, which is usually in the brainstem nuclei of the oculomotor nerve. The facial nerve, the glossopharyngeal nerve, and the vagus nerve, or within the lateral part of the gray matter of the spinal nerves from S1 to S2. The axons that extend to the effector organs in the head are embedded in the wall of the thorax, in the abdomen, and the pelvis. Now, the vagus nerve provides the parasympathetic innervation to the heart, to the lungs, to the liver, and to the stomach and other digestive organs. It is generally associated with the resting conditions, and the actions of your parasympathetic is usually to stimulate involuntary activities such as digestion, defecation, and urination through the release of digestive enzymes that enhances digestion and absorption of food. It lowers the heart rate, it lowers the blood pressure, and it constricts air passageway, decreasing your airflow. In other words, the action of your parasympathetics counters the action of your sympathetic division. Now, finally, we are now with the enteric nervous system, and it consists of plexuses within the walls of the digestive tract. It can monitor and control the activity of the digestive tract independently of the CNS through local reflexes. So, as we conclude our discussion, we now discuss the effects of aging on the nervous system. The sensory function declines due to the decrease in the number of sensory neurons, reduced functions of the remaining neurons, and decreased CNS processing. And usually motor neurons also decreases with 50% loss occurring at the age of 60 years old, resulting in the decline of muscle mass with the rapid fatigue as the remaining units must perform compensatory work. Also, the size of your brain decreases with loss of neurons in the cerebrum. And short-term memory is usually decreased, but long-term memory is not usually affected. Older people require more time to fall asleep and experience more period of waking during the night, which is due to the indigestion, rhythmic leg movement, sleep apnea, and decreased urinary bladder capacity and peripheral circulation. And I think that ends our lecture for this afternoon. Thank you for your kind attention. If you have some queries, clarifications, and questions, you can direct it through my messenger or you can call me anytime. Thank you and good day.